Hey friends, it's Tomer, and today I want to tell you about a problem I've had and, well, currently still have in Commander, and that is playing too much Magic in Commander. Sounds a bit weird? Let me explain. For those who don't know, I am a huge Izzet fanboy. I even busted out my Izzet t-shirt for this video, of course. I love everything about the color pair. Blue and red are my two favorite colors in Magic. I love the draw and control aspects of blue combined with the aggressiveness and explosiveness of red. I love the Ravnica guild that gives the color pair its name. I absolutely love Spellslinger as an archetype. I adore the guild's aesthetic too, with these lightning obsessed mad scientists all around. And I'm a big dragon fanboy too, so obviously Niv Mizzet has always been one of my favorite characters in Magic. Just a big, brilliant, egotistical jerk of a dragon. Absolutely stan ol' Nizzy. So early on, when I first started playing Commander, one of my first decks was, unsurprisingly, an Izzet Spellslinger list. One person in the playgroup already had a Niv Mizzet deck, so I wanted to try something a little bit different, and luckily for me, a brand new Izzet Commander was shortly previewed, Melek Izzet Paragon. And this was literally everything I could have hoped for. It is Izzet, it is Spellslinger matters, and it's a weird, and I absolutely love weirds. So as soon as Melek was released, I whipped up together an Izzet Spellslinger brew around it with all of my favorite Izzet Spellslinger cards, and I brought it over to the next Commander night, and I was super pumped to start playing with it. And it performed way better than expected. I popped off and had a blast storming off, generating a ton of mana, casting mana geysers and turnabouts, drawing cards with Intellectual Offering and Compulsive Research, and dumping all that mana into an epic experiment for a dozen extra spells to cast for free, copying a bunch of instants and sorceries for free along the way, of course. All while my gutter snipes were burning opponents and my Talrand was making an army of drakes. It was glorious. But when I stopped looking at my own cards and my sweet board state and started looking at my opponents, I could clearly see they were long checked out of the game, clearly not having a good time. The problem was, while I was having an amazing time storming off and casting a billion different spells, my opponents literally couldn't do anything during the time that I was doing this, so they were just sitting there watching me play the game of Magic. And that's obviously not fun for your opponents. Having one person playing solitaire for like 10 minutes straight and the rest of them just being spectators of the game that they're participating in, that's not really fun. We all signed up to play Magic, not just watch one person play Magic, right? I ended up trying Melek again, and again, I stormed off and took a 10-minute turn. I didn't end up winning the game. I just fizzled out after casting a bunch of spells, generating more mana, casting more spells, and then just not finding a finisher, and then my opponents quickly killed me. But nonetheless, I still took a 10-minute turn before dying. And when that happened, I decided I'm just going to take apart the deck. Because at the time, I figured there was no way for me to build a Melek Izzet Spellslinger deck without it being a 10-minute storm turn. So the problem I stumbled upon with Melek is a more generalized problem that I see in casual Commander, and that is the problem of time equity. In casual Commander, there's an expectation that everybody gets a chance to play the game. More specifically though, everybody gets a equal share of the total collective game time when everybody's sitting down at the table together. Basically, in a 4-player game of Commander, there's an expectation that every single person has roughly a quarter of the group's collective game time to do things in the game. This isn't some hard and fast rule, by the way. This is just a general observation that most people want an equal opportunity to participate in a game of Commander. So when one person starts hogging up way more game time than everybody else at the table, either by having one really long turn, like a storm type turn, or just having every single turn being way longer than everybody else's turn, then that can start going against the expectation of having time equity, and it can lead to frustrations at the table. Breaking time equity is something that I know a lot of people in the community struggle with too. There are certain decks and archetypes out there that have a tendency of taking up way more time than everybody else at the table. Pretty much all Storm decks are notorious for this, as the entire point of those decks is to set up one big turn casting a ton of spells and leading into a Storm finisher. Simply the act of casting and resolving all those spells take a while, but then add in the fact that you also have to keep track of all that floating mana, what your storm count is at, resolving all the triggered abilities that you have on board, and figuring out how to actually win at the end makes the entire thing slow and complicated for you, while your spectator opponents are bored and probably checking their phones. But it's not just storm decks either. There are certain archetypes in Commander that are notorious for taking up more and more of the group's collective game time. Super Friends is another one. When the deck gets to do its thing and have a whole bunch of planeswalkers, it can take a really long time to resolve each turn, since each planeswalker has a ton of text and multiple abilities that you need to choose which to use every single turn. I've had a friend who made an Atraxa Super Friends deck, and he ended up taking it apart because he just didn't like handling all those planeswalkers every single turn. The Blink archetype also has this problem. When your entire deck revolves around permanents that enter the battlefield with triggers and a bunch of ways to constantly blink and re-trigger those abilities, resolving everything can start taking a long time once you're blinking like 6 or more things per turn. Even worse is when blink decks are set up to be blinking not just on their own turn, but everybody's turn. Like if the blink deck assembles Urian and Restoration Angel to blink their entire board on each player's end step, taking even more time on everybody's turn than even the player whose turn it actually is. And beyond certain archetypes, there's also specific commanders that have a strong tendency to break time equity. The most obvious example being Nadu, which is even incredibly boring for modern players to watch as well in 1v1, but it's also a similar story with the popular commander Flubs, which also inevitably leads to long turns when the deck starts doing its thing. It's important to note that decks can break time equity without breaking other expectations in casual commander. For example, having a deck that is way more powerful than the rest of the table, or running salty cards. Like my Melik deck, for example, it wasn't more powerful than the rest of the table, and scrolling through EDH Rec's Salt page, you won't find any of those cards in my deck. The same can be said about Blink decks, or Super Friends, or any deck that is hogging up too much game time. It's not necessarily about power level or about salty cards, it's more about how the deck functions as a whole. Well, except for Nadu. Nadu should never be in casual commander in my opinion. Stick that one in CDH only. It's also incredibly easy to accidentally make a deck that hogs up all the game time, and I'm saying that from personal experience as someone who's been playing Commander for over a decade now. I mentioned that my Melik deck was my first experience bringing a solitaire deck to the table, but I actually ran into the same issue recently with my Myra the Magnificent deck. This is one of the coolest commanders that I did a Budget Brew article on 2 years ago, and my partner gifted me a version of it, which was incredibly sweet of him. It's an Izzet Spellslinger deck, which I love, but it's specifically not Storm. The deck doesn't have one big turn popping off. Instead, it's trying to, well, set up a theme park over the course of many turns, opening attractions with Myra, imprinting spells onto them, and then hoping to roll well and visit those attractions to cast even more spells. I'm not going to explain attractions here. I know the vast majority of you do not care, but I will say it's incredibly fun to pilot. It's also one of my weakest decks, which I actually find a positive attribute because most of my decks are tending to be more and more higher power, and I need to have a couple decks that are kind of lower power to play at lower power tables. But even though Myra isn't a Storm deck, even though it's budget and very janky, it ends up having similar pitfalls as my Melik list. Once I have mana engines online like Galazeth Prismari or Inspiring Statuary to turn all my attractions into mana rocks, I can cast spells with my attractions, which will open up more attractions, make elementals of Young Pyromancer, draw cards off my Archmage Emeritus, make treasures off my Stormkiln Artist, and then keep going and going. It's simply too many game actions to resolve. And the deck never wins either, by the way. It just kind of dirtles, takes really long turns as I assemble a bigger and bigger theme park, and then eventually I just get wiped, and it's incredibly hard to recover, and then I lose. So it's basically a whole lot of dirtling if I can get away with it, and then nothing. So if you, like me, have a deck that just takes too much time at the table, what can you do to solve it? Well, I have 3 solutions for you. The first thing is actually the easiest one to do and probably going to solve 99% of your issues, and that's just goldfishing your deck. play a bunch of solitaire games with your deck, going through from start to finish, from your mulligans to playing your lands to going over your hard to do combos or interactions. The more familiar you are with your own cards and the interactions within, the faster you're going to be piloting it in a real game. It's important to know what all the cards in your deck do, but also how they commonly interact with each other. For example, if you're running tutors, being able to know which cards you want to tutor up for any given situation ahead of time will make it much easier to resolve the tutors when you're in an actual game, as opposed to just like casting a tutor and not knowing what the heck you're going to be fetching up. That can take a while to resolve. I think if you find yourself in a position like me where you really want to play a storm deck, but you're afraid of taking up too much time at the table, gold fishing is the #1 solution to making sure that you don't actually take up that much time at the table. Since Storm is essentially a solitaire deck, you can just practice doing the solitaire thing on your own time so that you don't end up wasting your opponent's time in a real game. The second thing I would recommend, and this one is specifically towards Dirtle decks, is add more finishers to your deck. Something I see in a lot of Dirtle decks, and this is kind of like the common thread between all of them, is they're laser focused on card draw, on ramp, and interaction, and then they kind of forget to add finishers to their deck. A buddy of mine had a Brago King Eternal deck whose primary win condition was just hitting people with random ETB creatures like Muldrifter and Peregrine Drake. Because they get the job done eventually, so why bother running any other finishers, right? Well, Brago did win games, but each time it's because we conceded rather than actually dying to a 2/2 flyer. And the deck didn't last too long in the pond because people just didn't like playing against it. So instead of just hoping your deck will stumble into a win eventually by accident, just run some finishers to make sure you can close out the game. It could be combat damage, it could be a combo, just anything that works. Like, if I could swap one card into that Brago deck, it would have been Moonshaker Cavalry, just so we can all die faster. And I know some people might think this makes the deck worse because finishers aren't usually card draw or ramp, but in reality, being archenemy over the span of multiple turns gives your 3 opponents a bigger chance to figure out a way to stop you. So instead of giving your opponents a bigger window to interact and stomp you, instead just seal the deal with a finisher, and your opponents will actually thank you for it. Now, if you're already super familiar with your deck due to solitaire and lots of practice, and you made sure your deck has finishers to actually close out the game in a reasonable amount of time, and you're still not happy with how the deck performs, it's just hogging up way too much game time at the table, only then would I recommend just swapping out your commander with something that is a little bit faster. There are over 2,000 commander options at this point, so chances are there's another option out there that overlaps heavy with what your current commander is doing. So you could just try swapping out commanders while keeping as much of the 99 intact as possible, and just moving your old commander into the 99 instead. In my own case with Myra, I practiced with the deck a bunch and have tried many different styles of finishers for the deck, but nothing has made me 100% happy with the results. So I've decided to switch out Myra for a different Izzet Spellslinger deck, and weirdly enough, I ended up right where I started with a brand new Melik deck that I absolutely love. This is Melik Reforged Researcher. This version of Melik is still all about Spellslinger, but unlike the original one, it's definitely not Storm since its mana discount is only once per turn, and it's definitely not a Dirtle engine like Myra since Melik gets huge as you fill your graveyard with instants and sorceries. So this deck's game plan is to quickly fill the graveyard with cards like Traumatize and Cut Your Losses, and immediately swing in with a lethal sized commander, or turn Melik into a game-winning burn spell with Chandra's Ignition to take everybody out all at once, or just punch people to death with Gravitic Punch. The deck still runs a lot of my favorite Spellslinger cards, like tons of flashback spells and Quiet Speculation to tutor them up, and it can also create backup beaters with spells like Seize the Storm, or one of my favorite pet cards, Experimental Overload, which creates my absolute favorite creature token in the game. The art on it is just stunning in foil. So in the end, it's kind of amazing that I end up back with a Melik Izzet Spellslinger deck, but this time far better suited to a game experience that I'm aiming for. So that's my thoughts on time equity in Commander. It's a topic that I haven't seen covered in a video before, and I know it affects a lot of different play playgroups, and I haven't ever heard anybody label the problem as anything, so I'm calling it time equity. Let me know if you have a better name for it, but I think that kind of sums it up decently well. Hopefully this helps some of you out if you, like me, have a deck that hogs up too much game time and maybe is a little bit too dirtly or too stormy. Maybe there are some solutions in this video that can kind of help you kind of salvage that deck. This is my third video essay, so like and subscribe if you like these sort of video essays. Tell me if there's any topics you want to see covered in a future video. You can leave that in the comment section. Like and subscribe if you like this sort of things, and until next time, friends, see ya!